The man my family had spent 15 years warning me about looked up from his front porch, met my eyes across the driveway, and said, "I was wondering when you'd finally come." And just like that, everything I thought I knew about my own life began to unravel. My name is Claire. I'm 29 years old, and until 8 months ago, I believed I had a good family. Not perfect, no family is, but good, honest. The kind of family that shows up when it matters. My father had just died after a short battle with pancreatic cancer. My older brother Marcus had stepped up to handle the estate, and my fiancé Ryan had been holding my hand through all of it. I told myself I was lucky, even in the grief. I told myself I was surrounded by people who loved me. I was wrong about almost all of it. Growing up, Uncle Daniel was the ghost in our house. He was my father's younger brother, and his name came up exactly 2 ways, as a warning or as an explanation for why we didn't talk about certain things. My mother called him unstable. Marcus called him a leech. My father, who was the gentlest man I ever knew, would only go quiet and say, "Daniel made his choices." I learned early not to ask follow-up questions. The last time I had seen my uncle was at my grandmother's funeral when I was 14. He had stood a few feet apart from the rest of us, wearing a gray jacket that didn't quite fit, and when he tried to hug my father, my mother had stepped between them. Something passed between the 2 brothers that day, a look I didn't have the vocabulary for at 14. Now, at 29, I think I understand it. It was the look of a man who knows something and has made peace with the fact that no one will listen. After my father died, I started seeing Uncle Daniel's truck parked on the street outside our old family home. It was an old blue pickup, hard to miss. The first time, I mentioned it to Marcus, and he went rigid in that way. He does jaw tight, eyes flat, and said, "Stay away from him, Claire. Dad wouldn't want that." I didn't push back. I was grieving. I didn't have the energy for conflict. But then I started noticing things. Small things, at first. Ryan started working late more often, which he explained away as a new project at the firm. Marcus kept delaying the formal reading of my father's estate documents, always with a reasonable excuse: the lawyer was traveling, the paperwork needed a correction, give it another week. I had been named co-executor in my father's preliminary documents, the ones I'd seen when he was still alive and thinking clearly. But every time I brought up scheduling the formal meeting, I was gently redirected. "You've been through so much," Ryan would say, rubbing my shoulders. "Let Marcus handle it. You need to rest." And I would nod. And I would rest, because I was tired and sad, and I wanted to believe that the people around me were handling things. Then came the Tuesday evening that changed everything. I had gone back to my father's house to pick up a box of his books I'd been putting off collecting. Marcus had the house key and had told me the spare was under the back step. I let myself in, went upstairs, and was pulling books from the shelf in my father's study when I noticed the filing cabinet in the corner was unlocked. My father was meticulous about that cabinet. He locked it every time he left the room. I had watched him do it 100 times. I told myself it was nothing. I started to walk away. Then I turned back. The folder I found was labeled, in my father's handwriting, "Final Will Updated November." He had died in January. The documents inside were dated 3 weeks before his death, and they were detailed in a way that surprised me. My father had left the family home and the bulk of his investments to be split equally between Marcus and me, but there was a specific clause about a property in a neighboring county that I had never heard of. A piece of land he'd bought decades ago. In these documents, he had left it solely to me. I photographed every page with my phone, put the folder back exactly as I found it, and drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind running very, very fast. That night, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I looked up my uncle's address. He lived 12 minutes away. He had always lived 12 minutes away. I had not known this. No one had told me. I didn't go that night. I went to bed, stared at the ceiling, and had a long, quiet conversation with myself about what I was doing and why. I thought about what Marcus would say. I thought about Ryan's voice, that careful, reassuring tone he used when he wanted me to stop thinking so hard. I thought about my father's face at my grandmother's funeral, the look he'd tried to give his brother and hadn't been allowed to. I went the next morning. I want to be honest about what I did, because I'm not proud of the strategy, even though I think it was necessary. I didn't go to my uncle's house as myself. I went as the version of me that my family had always wanted me to be: soft, agreeable, a little overwhelmed, just a grieving daughter looking for connection after her father died. I wore no makeup. I brought nothing with me. I rehearsed, on the drive over, how to seem like I didn't know anything at all. My uncle was on his front porch when I pulled up. He looked older than I remembered, more gray, more lines around his eyes, but something in his posture was exactly the same: watchful, patient, like a man who had been waiting a long time for something and had stopped being impatient about it. He said, "I was wondering when you'd finally come." Not if. When. I said I was sorry it had taken so long. He said there was no need to apologize. He poured me coffee without asking if I wanted any, and we sat at his kitchen table, and for the first 20 minutes, we talked about my father, what he was like as a boy, the summer they spent 1 year on their grandfather's property in Tennessee, the way he used to laugh at his own jokes before anyone else laughed. I had to work hard to keep my composure, because no one had talked to me about my father like this, as a whole person with a history since he died. Everyone around me had been so take, so managed. My uncle just talked about his brother like he missed him, which he did, which was the most human thing anyone had said to me in months. Then he got quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. He said, "Did you find the filing cabinet?" I looked at him. I said, "What do you know about the filing cabinet?" He said, "Your father called me 3 weeks before he died. He told me he had updated his will. He was worried that things might get complicated after he was gone, and he wanted someone outside the immediate circle to know what the document said." He paused. He made me write it down. "The property in Caldwell County. He said it was yours." I put my cup down carefully. My uncle continued. He told me that he and my father had reconciled quietly about 2 years before my father's death, that the estrangement had never been about something my uncle did, it had been about something he knew. 15 years ago, he had discovered that Marcus had forged a signature on a loan document to get money from their parents. He had confronted Marcus. Marcus had denied it, and my mother had chosen to believe her son over my father's brother. My uncle had been slowly pushed out of the family picture after that, and rather than blow up the family my father loved, he had let it happen. "Your father was not a confrontational man," my uncle said. "He thought if he kept the peace long enough, things would settle down. He thought Marcus had grown up." I asked if he thought Marcus had grown up. My uncle looked at me. He said, "He's delaying the estate reading, isn't he?" It wasn't a question. I drove home and I sat in my parked car in front of my apartment for 45 minutes. I thought about the last 8 months. I thought about Marcus's careful management of every process, every timeline, every document. I thought about Ryan, who worked at a financial advisory firm, the same firm that, I now recalled, had done some work for my father in his last years. I thought about the number of times I had been gently discouraged from asking questions. I thought about how grief had made me cooperative in ways I wouldn't normally be, and I thought about whether anyone around me had been counting on that. I decided that I needed to be very, very careful, and I decided that I needed to stop seeming like I was paying attention. For the next 3 weeks, I was the most agreeable version of myself I have ever performed. I told Ryan I was feeling better. I stopped asking Marcus about the estate. I went to a dinner at my mother's house and smiled and helped with the dishes and did not look at my brother any differently than I ever had. I was pleasant and present and seemingly unburdened. At the same time, I found an estate attorney, not the one Marcus had been using, a different one entirely, a woman named Patricia who came recommended by my father's old accountant. I brought her the photos I had taken of my father's documents. She reviewed them and confirmed that the clause regarding the Caldwell County property was clearly stated and legally sound. Then she asked me if I had seen the version of the will that was being submitted for probate. I had not. She made a call. She had a contact in the county probate clerk's office who could pull the filing. It took 2 days. When the document came through, Patricia called me and her voice had a very specific quality, the careful, measured tone of someone who is about to tell you something you need to hear clearly. The version of the will submitted for probate did not include the Caldwell County property clause. The page had been replaced. The language was different, and the page number sequence had a subtle gap that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Someone had removed a page from my father's will. I sat in Patricia's office and I was very quiet for a long time. She gave me the space to be quiet. Then I asked her what we could do. She told me. It took 2 more weeks to gather what we needed. My uncle had a dated, handwritten record of his phone call with my father. My father had specifically asked him to write it down and note the date, which in retrospect tells you everything about what kind of man my father was and what he had expected might happen. Patricia also located a second copy of the original will through my father's previous attorney, who had retired but maintained his files. The 2 documents matched each other and contradicted what had been submitted to probate. During those 2 weeks, I had one conversation with Ryan that I will not forget. We were cooking dinner together on a Wednesday, and he said, casually, that he thought it might be a good idea to sell the Caldwell County property once the estate was settled. He said it like he already knew about it. He said it like he assumed I knew he knew. I kept chopping vegetables. I said, "What property?" He caught himself. He said, "Oh, I think Marcus mentioned something I don't know the details." I said, I kept cooking. My hands were completely still. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and I started cross-referencing dates. The financial advisory firm where Ryan worked had filed paperwork as a representative agent on 2 other parcels in my father's estate rolls that had been quietly added to the documentation after my father's death. Both parcels were smaller and lower value than the Caldwell County property. I think they had been a test run, or a distraction. What I felt in that moment was not what I expected. There was no explosion of emotion. I had been moving in this direction for weeks, and I think some part of me had already processed the grief of it, the grief of understanding who the person sleeping in the next room actually was. What I felt, sitting at that kitchen table at 2 a.m, was something much quieter and much colder. It felt like clarity. I called Patricia first thing in the morning. I told her about Ryan's comment. She said it was consistent with what she was already beginning to suspect, and that she was going to recommend we bring in a forensic document examiner before we moved forward with anything legal. I agreed. I went home. I made Ryan coffee. I kissed him on the cheek when he left for work. I had become very good at performing normal. The document examination took 10 days. The results were not ambiguous. The replacement page in the probated will had been printed on a different printer than the rest of the document, a detail invisible to the naked eye but clear under analysis. The paper had a slightly different weight, and the formatting of my father's signature block, on that page only, was off by a margin consistent with a copy that had been altered and reprinted. Marcus had submitted a forged document to probate court. Patricia filed a motion to contest the will on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Marcus had received notice. He called me 40 minutes later. And I will be honest, I let it go to voicemail the first time, just so I could hear his voice without having to respond in real time. He sounded calm, concerned. He said there must be some kind of misunderstanding and that we should talk before this went any further. I called him back. I was very warm. I said I agreed that we should talk and that I was sure it could all be sorted out. I suggested we meet at the family home that weekend. He said that sounded perfect. He did not know that Patricia would be joining us, or that she would be bringing the forensic report, or that the conversation would be documented. I am not going to describe that meeting in detail, because some things should stay private. What I will say is that my brother, when confronted with the specific evidence, the document analysis, the page inconsistencies, the original will from the retired attorney, my uncle's written record did not, in the end, have a good explanation. He had several bad ones. He tried, for a while, to suggest that I had manipulated our uncle against him, and then he tried to suggest that my father had been confused in his final weeks, and then he went quiet in the way that people go quiet when they have run out of room. My mother sat at the kitchen table the whole time and looked at her hands. Ryan stopped returning my calls 4 days later. He moved his things out of my apartment while I was at Patricia's office filing the amended probate petition. He left his key on the kitchen counter. He did not leave a note. My mother called me that night, and we had the most honest conversation we have ever had. She cried. She told me she had not known about the will, and I believe her, because I think my mother's great flaw is not malice but avoidance. She knows how to not see things. She has been practicing it for 30 years. She cried and I listened, and then I told her that I loved her and that some things were going to have to change and that I was not going to negotiate on that. She said, "I know." The probate court ruled in my favor 6 weeks later. The forged page was stricken from the record. The Caldwell County property, a 22-acre parcel with a small house on it, was transferred to me in accordance with my father's actual final wishes. Marcus is facing a separate legal process that I am not going to discuss because it's ongoing and because my attorney told me not to. The morning after the ruling, I drove out to the Caldwell County property for the first time. I had looked at it on maps but never seen it in person. The small house at the end of the gravel drive was older and needed work, but the land itself was extraordinary, wide and quiet, with a creek running along the back edge and a view of the hills that my father had apparently loved for decades without ever telling me about it. I sat on the front steps for a long time. I thought about my father, who had been a man of quiet gestures, who had called his estranged brother 3 weeks before his death and asked him to write something down, just in case, who had trusted me with something specific and valuable not because he wanted to start a conflict, but because he believed I was the one in the family who would handle it with integrity. I thought about all the times I had been encouraged to rest, to defer, to let other people manage the complicated things. I thought about how grief had made me soft in ways that people around me had tried to use, and I thought about the moment I had stopped letting it. I thought about my uncle, who had spent 15 years being called unstable by people who needed him to stay quiet, and who had sat across from me at his kitchen table and waited patiently for me to find my own way to the truth. I called him from the front steps. I told him the ruling had come through. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father would be glad." I said, "I think he would." My uncle asked if the property was what my father had described to him. I looked out at the land, the hills, the flat silver line of the creek in the distance. I said, "It's better. I still live in my apartment in the city. I haven't decided yet what I'll do with the property in Caldwell County, whether I'll eventually move there or rent the house or just drive out on quiet weekends and sit on the steps and think. What I do know is that it exists, that it's mine, and that my father made sure of that when he still could. What I know about Ryan is less now than I thought I knew when we were together. I know that he was strategic in ways I didn't recognize because I wasn't looking for it. I know that I want, eventually, to understand how I missed the signs not to punish myself, but because I think I owe myself the honest accounting of it. What I know about my brother is complicated in the way that things are when you love someone and they have done something that cannot be undone. I have not spoken to him since the hearing. My mother visits me sometimes, and we are careful with each other, and it feels like the beginning of something we have to build slowly from scratch. What I know about my uncle is the simplest thing, and maybe the most important. He told the truth when it cost him something, and he waited for the rest of us to be ready to hear it. There is something about that kind of patience that I have been thinking about ever since. The day I drove out to that property, before I called my uncle, I walked around the back of the small house to the edge of the creek. The water was cold and fast, and it sounded clean. My father had stood at this same creek bank and thought it was worth keeping. He had thought it was mine. I stood there for a while, in the quiet, and let that be enough. The people who told me to rest, while they rearranged the pieces around me, underestimated one thing: that grief, when you move through it with your eyes open, doesn't make you weaker. It shows you exactly what is real and what was only ever comfortable fiction. And once you can see that clearly, there is no going back to pretending you can't. I'm not the woman they thought I was. I think I might be the woman my father believed I was, which is something I'm still learning how to live up to. But I have 22 acres and a creek and all the time I need. I'll figure it out.